In the humid shadows of coastal Georgia's historic preservation district, some secrets are worth killing for. On the evening of October 14, 2023, Dr. Catherine Whitmore drove her silver Honda Accord through the moss-draped entrance of Blackwater Historic House Museum in rural Georgia. The headlights swept across ancient live oaks as she navigated the circular drive leading to the antebellum mansion that had been converted into a premier Civil War preservation facility. Catherine, a 42-year-old specialist in Civil War artifact authentication, had made this after-hours trip at the specific request of the museum's board. In the back seat of her car, secured in climate-controlled cases, was nearly $50,000 worth of specialized equipment. Museum Director James Beauregard III met her at the staff entrance. Security footage from that evening shows him leading Catherine through the darkened corridors to the museum's climate-controlled authentication laboratory, a modern addition hidden behind the preserved 1840s architecture. The donated collection awaiting her examination had arrived just 2 weeks earlier from the estate of Margaret Beauregard Ashton, a descendant of the plantation's original owners who had died at age 93. According to the museum's acquisition records, the collection contained what appeared to be previously unknown Civil War correspondence and photographs from the plantation's wartime period. If authentic, these materials would provide unprecedented insight into daily life at Blackwater during the 1860s, potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors and invaluable to historians. Catherine began her methodical work at approximately 8:30 p.m. Security cameras captured her arranging the artifacts on examination tables, adjusting her equipment, and beginning the painstaking process of authentication. She photographed each item under multiple lighting conditions, took samples for chemical analysis, and made detailed notes in her digital authentication log. The collection included 12 letters supposedly written by Confederate soldiers stationed at the plantation, 6 daguerreotype photographs showing the property during wartime, and a leather-bound journal attributed to the plantation owner's wife, detailing daily life during the Union occupation of nearby Savannah in 1864. By 10:15 p.m., Catherine had moved to the spectral analysis phase of her examination. This cutting-edge technique uses light wavelengths invisible to the human eye to reveal hidden text, detect age-related changes in materials, and identify anachronistic elements that might indicate forgery. The work required intense concentration and complete darkness, except for the specialized lighting equipment. Security footage shows Catherine working steadily until 11:47 p.m., when she appears to discover something that causes her to lean back from her microscope and examine one of the documents more closely under different lighting conditions. She can be seen making rapid notes on her tablet and photographing specific sections of what appears to be a letter. At 11:52 p.m., the security camera records Catherine standing abruptly, gathering several of the documents, and moving toward the far corner of the laboratory where additional examination equipment was stored. The camera angle doesn't capture this area clearly, but her shadowy figure can be seen moving back and forth between different workstations. Then at 12:23 a.m. on October 15th, the laboratory appears empty. Catherine Whitmore had vanished. When museum security guard Tom Hendricks made his 6 a.m. rounds later that morning, he found the authentication laboratory in a state of controlled chaos. Catherine's equipment was still running, humming quietly in the dawnlight. The specialized lighting was still on. Her coffee cup sat half-empty on the examination table, still warm to the touch. But Catherine was gone. Her purse remained on the counter with her car keys and cell phone inside. The artifacts were scattered across multiple examination stations, as if she had been moving quickly between different pieces of equipment. Most disturbing, several of the most valuable items from the collection were lying exposed on examination tables without their protective coverings. Hendricks immediately contacted James Beauregard, who arrived within 20 minutes and made the decision to call the Blackwater County Sheriff's Department. The response would begin what would become one of the most puzzling disappearance cases in Georgia's recent history. The question that would haunt investigators from the very beginning was simple but profound. Why would an experienced, meticulous professional like Catherine Whitmore abandon $50,000 worth of equipment and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of irreplaceable artifacts in the middle of her work? What could have compelled her to leave so suddenly that she didn't even take her purse or lock the laboratory door? Within 48 hours of Catherine Whitmore's disappearance, the case had attracted the attention of the FBI's art crime team, a specialized unit that investigates theft and fraud involving cultural artifacts. Agent Maria Santos, who had begun her law enforcement career with the Blackwater County Sheriff's Department before transferring to federal service, found herself leading an investigation that would reveal the complex world of Civil War artifact authentication. Catherine's credentials were impeccable. She held a PhD in American history from Emory University with a specialization in Civil War material culture, and had completed additional training in forensic document analysis at the FBI's laboratory in Quantico. Over the past 15 years, she had authenticated artifacts from major museums across the Southeast, including the Atlanta History Center, the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, and the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Whitmore was considered one of the most thorough and reliable authenticators in her field, Agent Santos noted in her initial report. Museums specifically requested her services because of her reputation for uncovering forgeries that had fooled other experts. She had developed a methodology that combined traditional historical research with cutting-edge scientific analysis. James Beauregard III provided investigators with detailed background on the collection Catherine had been examining. The artifacts had been donated by the estate of Margaret Beauregard Ashton, who had lived in a restored carriage house on the museum grounds until her death in September 2023. Margaret had been the great-great-granddaughter of Colonel William Beauregard, the plantation's original owner. Miss Margaret was very particular about preserving the family legacy, Beauregard explained during his interview with federal agents. She had spent decades collecting family documents and photographs that had been scattered among various relatives after the Civil War. This donation represented the culmination of her life's work in historical preservation. The Beauregard Family Foundation, which provided the majority of the museum's operating budget, had specifically requested Catherine's services for this authentication. The foundation's board included prominent historians, museum professionals, and descendants of several old Georgia families. Their stated goal was to ensure that any artifacts displayed in the museum met the highest standards of historical accuracy. But Catherine's preliminary findings, recovered from her digital notes and the memory cards in her cameras, told a more complex story. Her authentication log, which she had been updating in real time during her examination, contained several entries marked with red flags, her personal coding system for items that required additional scrutiny. The first red flag appeared at 9:23 p.m. on October 14th, when Catherine noted that one of the Civil War letters was written on paper that showed inconsistent aging patterns under UV examination. Her notes indicated that while the paper appeared appropriately aged to the naked eye, spectral analysis revealed that the aging process had been artificially accelerated using techniques not available during the 1860s. By 10:45 p.m., Catherine had identified additional problems. Several of the photographs showed signs of digital manipulation, despite being presented as original daguerreotypes from the 1860s. Her notes describe pixel-level inconsistencies suggesting modern digital enhancement of original period photographs. Most significantly, she had discovered that the ink used in several key documents contained synthetic compounds that weren't developed until the early 1900s. The leather-bound journal attributed to the plantation owner's wife presented the most complex authentication challenge. Catherine's initial examination suggested that while the leather binding and paper were genuinely from the Civil War era, much of the text had been added later. Her notes describe finding at least 3 distinct ink compositions and writing styles, suggesting multiple authors across different time periods. What made these findings particularly significant was the nature of the content being questioned. The documents Catherine was flagging as potentially inauthentic all supported a specific narrative about the Blackwater plantation's role during the Civil War. They described a benevolent plantation owner who treated enslaved people humanely, Confederate soldiers who fought nobly for states' rights rather than slavery, and a post-war period of peaceful reconciliation between former masters and freed slaves. Catherine's analysis suggested that this narrative had been carefully constructed and reinforced through the systematic creation and alteration of historical documents. Her notes indicate that she was planning to cross-reference her findings with similar collections at other Civil War museums to determine if this was an isolated case or part of a broader pattern. The last entry in Catherine's authentication log was recorded at 11:51 p.m. on October 14th, just minutes before she disappeared from the security cameras. The entry consists of a single line, pattern consistent with lost cause mythology construction. Cross-reference needed with Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston collections. Potential coordinated historical falsification. Agent Santos interviewed several of Catherine's professional colleagues to understand the implications of her findings. Dr. Emily Richardson, a historian at the University of Georgia who had collaborated with Catherine on previous authentication projects, explained the significance of what Catherine had discovered. If Catherine's preliminary findings were correct, this wasn't just a case of someone trying to sell fake artifacts for money, Dr. Richardson told investigators. This was about controlling historical narrative on an institutional level. The kind of coordinated effort Catherine was describing would have required significant resources, expertise, and institutional cooperation. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars invested in creating and maintaining a particular version of Civil War history. The question facing investigators became increasingly clear. Had Catherine Whitmore stumbled upon something much larger than simple artifact forgery? And if so, who had the motivation and resources to make her disappear before she could expose it? The Blackwater plantation's transformation from working agricultural estate to prestigious historical museum had been anything but simple. Local historian Dr. Samuel Cross, professor emeritus at nearby Valdosta State University, had spent 20 years researching the property's complex past and provided investigators with crucial context for understanding what Catherine Whitmore might have discovered. The original plantation was established in 1837 by Colonel William Beauregard, a cotton planter who had migrated south from South Carolina. By 1860, the property encompassed over 3,000 acres worked by 127 enslaved people, making it one of the larger agricultural operations in coastal Georgia. But unlike many plantations, Blackwater had survived the Civil War with its main structures intact, largely because Union forces had used it as a temporary headquarters during their march toward Savannah. What makes Blackwater unique, Dr. Cross explained to federal investigators, is how completely its post-war history was reconstructed during the Civil Rights era. In 1968, when racial integration was transforming the South, the Beauregard descendants made a very calculated decision to turn the property into a museum that would present a specific version of antebellum and Civil War. Property records revealed that the museum's establishment had been funded entirely by the newly created Beauregard Family Foundation, which provided an initial endowment of $2.3 million. This foundation, controlled by descendants of the original plantation family, had continued to provide the majority of the museum's operating budget for over 50 years. By 2023, their total investment in the property exceeded $15 million. The timing of the museum's creation was significant. As Dr. Cross noted, 1968 was the height of the Civil Rights Movement, when traditional Southern narratives about slavery and the Civil War were facing unprecedented scrutiny. The Beauregard Museum opened with an exhibition that emphasized the genteel aspects of plantation life, the honor of Confederate military service, and the mutual respect between enslaved people and their owners. The descendants weren't just preserving history, Dr. Cross observed. They were actively shaping it. The museum became a pilgrimage site for people who wanted to believe in a romanticized version of the Old South, and it was enormously successful in that mission. James Beauregard III, the current museum director and great-great-grandson of the original plantation owner, had been specifically chosen for his role because of his family connection and his graduate degree in museum studies. During his interview with investigators, he described the careful curation process that governed all museum exhibitions. Every artifact, every document, every photograph displayed in our museum goes through rigorous authentication, Beauregard insisted. The Family Foundation established strict protocols to ensure historical accuracy. We've never displayed anything that hadn't been verified by recognized experts in the field. However, museum staff members, speaking confidentially to investigators, revealed a more complex picture of how authentication worked at Blackwater. Several employees noted that Catherine Whitmore had been asking unusual questions about gaps in the museum's documented history, particularly regarding the actual living conditions of enslaved people and the plantation's activities during Reconstruction. Mary Ellen Tucker, who had worked as the museum's archival assistant for 12 years, told investigators that Catherine had requested access to original plantation records that weren't normally shown to visiting researchers. She wanted to see the actual slave inventories, the overseer reports, the post-war labor contracts, Tucker recalled. Most researchers just look at the family letters and photographs we have on display. Catherine wanted to see everything. What Catherine had discovered in those archived records became clear when investigators examined the materials she had been reviewing in the weeks before her disappearance. Hidden in filing cabinets in the museum's basement were documents that told a very different story about Blackwater Plantation than the one presented in the public exhibitions. Overseer reports from the 1850s described brutal working conditions, frequent use of physical punishment, and enslaved people who repeatedly attempted to escape. Post-war labor contracts revealed that the plantation had continued operating with unpaid labor well into the 1870s, using debt peonage and sharecropping arrangements that kept former slaves bound to the property under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. Most significantly, Catherine had found evidence that the Beauregard family had been actively involved in local Ku Klux Klan activities during Reconstruction, using violence and intimidation to maintain control over black laborers. These documents had been carefully preserved in the family archives, but were never mentioned in the museum's historical presentations. Dr. Cross helped investigators understand the broader implications of Catherine's research. What she was discovering wasn't unique to Blackwater, he explained. Across the South, prominent families have invested enormous resources in controlling how their ancestors' histories are remembered. Museums, monuments, academic programs, they've all been used to promote a sanitized version of the past that emphasizes honor and tradition while minimizing the realities of slavery and racial violence. The Beauregard Family Foundation's financial records, obtained through federal subpoena, revealed the scope of their historical influence. Beyond funding the Blackwater Museum, the foundation provided significant support to Civil War museums and historical societies across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. In each case, the funding came with specific requirements about how historical materials would be presented and interpreted. Investigators discovered that Catherine had been cross-referencing authentication work across multiple institutions supported by similar family foundations. Her preliminary research suggested a coordinated effort to promote lost cause mythology through the systematic presentation of carefully selected, and in some cases apparently fabricated, historical evidence. The question that emerged from this investigation was profound. If Catherine had uncovered evidence of coordinated historical manipulation worth millions of dollars in museum funding and family reputation, how far would the people involved go to protect their investment in a particular version of the past? The sophisticated equipment Catherine Whitmore had brought to Blackwater represented the cutting edge of forensic authentication technology. FBI forensic specialists who examined her devices in the days following her disappearance were able to reconstruct her entire examination process through the data stored on her cameras, computers, and analysis instruments. Catherine's methodology combined traditional historical research with advanced scientific analysis in ways that few other authenticators had mastered. Her multispectral imaging system could photograph documents using 19 different wavelengths of light, revealing hidden text, detecting alterations, and identifying materials invisible to standard photography. Her portable chemical analysis kit could determine the precise composition of inks, papers, and adhesives down to the molecular level. Dr. Whitmore's approach was revolutionary, explained Dr. James Morrison, director of the FBI's Forensic Document Laboratory. Most authenticators rely primarily on visual examination and basic chemical tests. Catherine had developed protocols that could detect sophisticated forgeries that would fool traditional authentication methods. Her work was changing the entire field. The data recovered from Catherine's equipment revealed a systematic pattern of historical manipulation that went far beyond simple forgery. Her digital files showed that she had used her multispectral imaging to examine every document in the Beauregard collection, creating a comprehensive database of her findings. The first major discovery came when Catherine examined what appeared to be a letter dated April 15, 1863, supposedly written by a Confederate soldier stationed at Blackwater Plantation. Under normal lighting, the letter appeared authentic, with appropriately aged paper and faded ink that matched other documents from the period. But Catherine's spectral analysis revealed multiple layers of deception. The paper, while genuinely from the mid-19th century, showed evidence of having been artificially aged using techniques developed in the 1920s. The original letter had been written by a Union soldier describing the harsh treatment of enslaved people he had witnessed. This text had been carefully removed using chemical bleaching. A new text had been added describing the plantation in romanticized terms, consistent with lost cause mythology. The level of sophistication was extraordinary, noted FBI forensic specialist Dr. Sarah Chen, who analyzed Catherine's findings. Whoever created these alterations had access to period-appropriate materials, advanced chemical knowledge, and detailed understanding of Civil War history. This wasn't the work of amateur forgers trying to make quick money. This was institutional-level historical manipulation. Catherine's analysis of the daguerreotype photographs revealed even more complex deception. The images appeared to show the plantation during wartime, with well-dressed enslaved people working contentedly alongside their owners. But her infrared photography detected digital manipulation that had been seamlessly integrated with authentic period photographs. The original photographs had shown enslaved people in chains, evidence of physical punishment, and deplorable living conditions. Using advanced digital techniques, these disturbing elements had been removed and replaced with idealized scenes of harmonious plantation life. The alterations had been printed using period-appropriate photographic processes, making them virtually undetectable without sophisticated analysis. Most significantly, Catherine had discovered that the leather-bound journal attributed to the plantation owner's wife contained at least 4 different layers of text, written over a span of nearly 60 years. The original entries, dating from the 1860s, described the brutal realities of managing enslaved labor and the family's involvement in post-war racial violence. Subsequent editions, apparently made in the 1920s and again in the 1960s, had systematically altered this narrative. References to violence had been removed, descriptions of enslaved people had been softened, and entirely fictional accounts of benevolent treatment had been added. The final layer of alterations, made shortly before the journal was donated to the museum, had refined the mythology even further. Catherine's digital notes revealed her growing understanding of what she had uncovered. "This isn't random historical revision," she wrote in an entry dated October 12, 2 days before her disappearance. "This is systematic narrative construction spanning multiple generations. Someone has invested enormous resources in creating and maintaining a completely false version of this plantation's history." Her research had extended beyond the Beauregard collection to similar materials at other Civil War museums across the Southeast. Using her professional connections, Catherine had been quietly examining artifacts at institutions in Richmond, Atlanta, Charleston, and Montgomery. Her preliminary findings suggested that the same techniques and materials used to alter the Blackwater documents had been employed at multiple locations. Pattern analysis indicates coordinated historical manipulation across at least 6 major Civil War preservation sites, Catherine noted in her research files. Similar paper treatments, identical ink compositions, consistent narrative alterations. This appears to be a network of institutions working together to promote lost cause mythology through fabricated historical evidence. The financial implications of Catherine's discoveries were staggering. The museums involved had collectively received tens of millions of dollars in public and private funding based on their claimed historical authenticity. Educational programs, research grants, and tourism revenue all depended on the credibility of their collections. Catherine's final authentication entries, recorded in the hours before her disappearance, showed her preparing to publish her findings. She had contacted editors at 3 major historical journals and had scheduled presentations at upcoming academic conferences. Her research threatened to expose not just individual forgeries, but an entire infrastructure of institutional historical manipulation. The last technical entry in Catherine's log was recorded at 11:43 p.m. on October 14th. Spectral analysis complete. Evidence pattern confirms systematic falsification. Documentary proof of coordinated lost cause mythology construction. Ready for publication and criminal referral. 4 minutes later, she vanished from the museum's security cameras. The question that haunted investigators was whether Catherine's disappearance was connected to her impending exposure of what might be the largest historical fraud in American museum history. 3 weeks into the investigation, FBI Art Crime Team Agent Maria Santos made a discovery that would expand the scope of Catherine Whitmore's disappearance far beyond Blackwater County. Working with federal financial crime analysts, Santos uncovered a web of connections that stretched across the Southeast, all tied to the Beauregard Family Foundation. The foundation, incorporated in Delaware in 1967, controlled assets worth over $42 million. Tax records showed it funded not just the Blackwater Historic House Museum, but 17 other Civil War preservation sites across Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. Each institution presented remarkably similar historical narratives about noble Confederate service, faithful enslaved populations, and peaceful post-war reconciliation. But Catherine's research had revealed something troubling. Her digital files, recovered from cloud backups, showed she had been conducting what she called cross-institutional authentication, comparing artifacts and documents across multiple foundation-funded museums. The patterns she discovered suggested coordinated deception. Dr. Whitmore had identified what appeared to be a systematic effort to present a specific version of Civil War and Reconstruction history. Agent Santos noted in her supplemental report, multiple institutions were exhibiting documents and artifacts that supported identical historical claims, despite being supposedly independent discoveries from different family estates. Catherine's research notes revealed her growing suspicions. In a file dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance, she had written, "The Mayfield Museum's recently discovered letters describing happy slave families mirror almost exactly the Thornton House's collection from last year. Same handwriting analysis anomalies. Same handwriting analysis anomalies. Same paper composition. Same artificial aging patterns. Someone is manufacturing a coordinated historical narrative." Most significantly, Catherine had been preparing to publish her findings. Her computer files included draft articles for the Journal of American Historical Authentication and correspondence with the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute. The working title of her paper was stark: "The Lost Cause Legacy: How Private Foundations Shape Public Memory Through Systematic Artifact Manipulation." The implications were staggering. If Catherine's research was correct, millions of museum visitors across the Southeast were viewing carefully constructed historical fiction presented as authentic artifacts. School children on educational trips, tourists seeking to understand American history, researchers conducting academic work, all potentially misled by a network of institutions presenting coordinated historical mythology. But Catherine's investigation had not gone unnoticed. Agent Santos discovered that Dr. Whitmore had been receiving anonymous warnings for months. Email traces revealed messages sent through encrypted services, warning her to focus on authentication, not interpretation, and to respect the boundaries of accepted historical frameworks. One message, sent just 4 days before her disappearance, was particularly chilling. "Some stories are better left undisturbed. Your research threatens institutions that employ hundreds and educate thousands. Consider the consequences of your actions before proceeding." The Foundation's board of directors included several prominent figures: retired federal judges, former state legislators, and descendants of some of the South's most influential families. These were not fringe actors, but respected community leaders with extensive political and economic connections. Agent Santos attempted to interview board members, but encountered unexpected resistance. Lawyers representing the Foundation argued that Catherine's research constituted defamatory speculation that could damage important cultural institutions. They declined to make board members available for interviews and obtain court orders, limiting access to Foundation records. Meanwhile, other historians began coming forward with similar experiences. Dr. Rachel Martinez at Auburn University reported that her research into Reconstruction-era labor practices had been quietly discouraged by department administrators after Foundation representatives expressed concerns about inflammatory historical revisionism. Professor James Washington at Emory revealed that his graduate students had been denied access to certain archived materials at Foundation-funded museums, with curators claiming the documents were too fragile for research use, despite being readily available for tourist exhibitions. The pattern was clear. Legitimate historical research that challenged prevailing narratives was being systematically discouraged, while museums continued to present carefully curated versions of history that supported specific cultural and political perspectives. But the most disturbing discovery came when Agent Santos examined the timing of the Foundation's expansion. The organization had dramatically increased its funding of Civil War museums during the 1990s and 2000s, periods of renewed national debate about Confederate symbolism and slavery's historical legacy. As Agent Santos noted in a confidential memo to FBI headquarters, the Beauregard Family Foundation appears to be using historical preservation as a form of narrative control, shaping public understanding of American history through systematic manipulation of museum collections. Dr. Whitmore's disappearance occurred just as she was preparing to expose this network to national scrutiny. The question remained, how far would such a network go to protect decades of careful historical construction? And what had Catherine Whitmore discovered that made her dangerous enough to silence? By early December 2023, the search for Catherine Whitmore had consumed over 400 volunteer hours and significant county resources. Sheriff David Parsons coordinated with specialized teams from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment to systematically scan the Blackwater Historic House Museum grounds. What they discovered on December 8th changed the entire complexion of the investigation. EPR technician Lisa Chen was conducting routine sweeps of the museum's formal gardens when her equipment detected unusual soil disturbances near the old carriage house foundation. The readings showed distinct rectangular patterns approximately 6 feet in length, buried roughly 4 feet below the current ground level. The soil composition was clearly different, Chen later reported. These disturbances showed characteristics of intentional excavation and backfilling, but the compaction patterns suggested they were much older than Dr. Whitmore's disappearance, possibly decades old. More disturbing was the discovery of Catherine's rental car 4 days later. On December 12th, hunters found the white Honda Civic abandoned on Piney Creek Road, 15 miles northeast of the museum. The vehicle sat 20 yards off the gravel roadway, partially hidden by kudzu vines and winter bare sweet gum trees. Inside the car, investigators found Catherine's purse, wallet, and cell phone, all items someone fleeing would typically take. Her authentication equipment, however, was missing. The specialized multispectral imaging camera worth over $30,000, her portable X-ray fluorescence analyzer, and her laptop containing months of research had all been removed. Deputy Sarah Martinez, who processed the vehicle, noted something peculiar. The car was positioned very deliberately. Security footage from a gas station on Highway 301 provided the investigation's most significant lead. Timestamp 11:52 p.m. on October 14th showed Catherine's Honda pulling away from the museum, followed 30 seconds later by a dark-colored pickup truck with obscured license plates. The footage was grainy, recorded by an older camera system, but enhancement revealed the pursuing vehicle appeared to be a Ford F-150, model year 2015-2018, with what looked like commercial or farm use modifications. Unfortunately, in rural Blackwater County, such vehicles were common among residents, contractors, and agricultural workers. FBI technical analysts traced the truck's route using additional security cameras from businesses along Highway 301. The pursuit continued for approximately 8 miles before both vehicles disappeared from camera coverage on rural back roads leading toward the Ohoopee River wetlands. Meanwhile, the investigation faced unexpected institutional pressure. Museum Board Chairman Harrison Beauregard III retained Atlanta law firm Morrison and Associates, specialists in cultural institution litigation. Their attorneys contacted Sheriff Parsons directly, expressing concerns about unnecessary disruption to museum operations and potential damage to historical artifacts during invasive searches. The timing was significant. The museum was preparing for its annual Winter Heritage Festival, which typically drew over 5,000 visitors and generated substantial revenue for Blackwater County's tourism-dependent economy. Board members argued that continued law enforcement presence would discourage attendance and harm local businesses. County Commissioner Patricia Hendricks found herself balancing competing pressures. "We need to find Dr. Whitmore," she stated at a public meeting on December 15th. "But we also can't ignore the economic impact on our community. The museum employs 47 people and brings in over $2 million annually in tourism revenue." Some community members questioned whether the search was being conducted with appropriate urgency. Rebecca Chen, who operated a bed and breakfast near the museum, observed, "I've lived here 30 years, and I've never seen law enforcement move so carefully around the Beauregard family's interests. Usually when someone goes missing, they search everywhere immediately. Agent Santos faced similar challenges at the federal level. Her requests for expanded surveillance of Foundation board members were denied by supervising agents who cited insufficient evidence of federal crimes and concerns about constitutional protections for private Foundation activities. The ground-penetrating radar searches were suspended on December 18th after museum attorneys obtained a temporary restraining order, arguing that continued excavation could damage historically significant landscaping and archaeological features. The court ruling allowed only minimal invasive techniques and required advance notification of any future search activities. By year's end, the physical search had expanded to cover over 40 square miles of Blackwater County's rural areas. Volunteer teams, organized by Catherine's sister Linda Morrison, continued weekend searches of hiking trails, abandoned properties, and wetland areas despite decreasing daylight hours and winter weather. But perhaps most troubling was what wasn't being searched. The museum's main buildings, including storage areas and basement archives, remained largely off-limits due to ongoing legal challenges. The Foundation's other properties across the Southeast had not been examined at all, with attorneys arguing that federal search warrants lacked sufficient probable cause. As Sheriff Parsons noted in his year-end report, we're dealing with a missing person case that involves significant institutional interests, complex legal protections, and political considerations that extend far beyond normal law enforcement procedures. Dr. Whitmore vanished, but the circumstances suggest her disappearance may be connected to powerful organizations with the resources and motivation to protect themselves. The question haunting investigators remained: were they searching for Catherine Whitmore, or were they being systematically prevented from finding her? 6 months after Catherine Whitmore vanished from the Blackwater Historic House Museum, her case officially transitioned to an active status within the FBI's Art Crime Team database. Agent Maria Santos submitted her final report on April 15, 2024, concluding that while significant irregularities had been discovered in the Foundation-funded museum network, insufficient evidence existed to establish federal crimes related to Dr. Whitmore's disappearance. The Beauregard Family Foundation's response was swift and comprehensive. By May 2024, the organization had hired Montgomery Public Relations, a crisis management firm specializing in institutional reputation protection. Their campaign emphasized the Foundation's 60-year commitment to preserving Southern heritage and characterized Catherine's research as academically irresponsible speculation that threatened respected cultural institutions. The museum itself reopened its Civil War exhibition in March 2024, but with notable changes. The artifacts Catherine had been authenticating were displayed using traditional historical narratives, with interpretive plaques describing them as donated family heirlooms, representing the experiences of the Beauregard family during the Civil War era. No mention was made of authentication concerns or disputed provenance. Museum Director James Beauregard III emphasized the institution's renewed focus on educational programming that honors historical complexity while respecting family legacies. The controversial documents Catherine had questioned were relegated to archival storage pending further conservation work, effectively removing them from public view indefinitely. But Catherine's research had already begun spreading through academic networks. Her sister Linda Morrison granted access to Catherine's cloud-stored files through probate court proceedings, shared the authentication data with historians at multiple universities. The evidence was compelling enough to prompt several scholars to begin their own investigations. Dr. Rachel Martinez at Auburn University quietly launched what she called the Authenticity Project, using Catherine's methodology to examine Civil War artifacts at Foundation-funded museums across the Southeast. Her preliminary findings, shared through encrypted academic forums, confirmed Catherine's suspicions: systematic historical manipulation spanning decades and multiple institutions. Dr. Whitmore's work revealed something unprecedented, Martinez noted in a confidential memo circulated among trusted colleagues. This isn't just about individual artifact forgeries. It's about the systematic construction of historical narratives designed to support specific political and cultural perspectives. The implications for American historical education are staggering. Meanwhile, other Foundation-funded museums across the region began experiencing unexpected developments. The Thornton House Museum in South Carolina quietly withdrew its Civil War letter collection from exhibition, citing routine conservation concerns. Mississippi's Magnolia Heritage Center announced that its slavery exhibition would be updated to reflect evolving historical scholarship. The Piedmont Civil War Museum in Alabama postponed indefinitely a planned expansion featuring recently acquired family documents. The pattern was unmistakable. Institutions connected to the Foundation network were quietly distancing themselves from potentially questionable artifacts, suggesting that Catherine's research had identified genuine authentication problems across multiple sites. By summer 2024, anonymous historians using encrypted communication platforms had established what they called the Whitmore Archive, a digital repository of Catherine's research, data combined with ongoing investigations into Foundation-funded historical institutions. The archive documented patterns of artifact manipulation, coordinated narrative construction, and systematic suppression of historical research that challenged prevailing interpretations. One particularly disturbing discovery emerged when researchers analyzed the timing of Foundation activities. The organization's most aggressive museum funding campaigns had coincided with periods of national debate about Confederate symbolism, slavery's historical legacy, and racial justice movements. The Foundation appeared to be using historical preservation as a form of cultural warfare, shaping public memory through careful control of museum narratives. But the most haunting questions remained unanswered. What had happened to Catherine Whitmore on that October night in Blackwater County? The ground-penetrating radar anomalies on museum grounds were never fully excavated due to ongoing legal challenges. The dark pickup truck captured on security footage was never identified. The threats Catherine had received were traced to encrypted services that provided no useful investigative leads. Sheriff David Parsons continued to receive occasional tips about the case, but most proved unfounded. A hiker reported finding old bones near Piney Creek Road, but forensic analysis revealed deer remains. A fisherman claimed to have seen something suspicious in the Ohope River wetlands, but underwater search teams found nothing relevant to the investigation. Perhaps most troubling was the institutional response to Catherine's disappearance. Rather than transparency and cooperation, the investigation had encountered legal obstacles, political pressure, and systematic resistance from organizations that claimed to serve public education. The message was clear. Some historical narratives were too valuable to risk exposing to authentic scholarly scrutiny. As the first anniversary of Catherine's disappearance approached in October 2024, Linda Morrison organized a memorial symposium titled Truth in Historical Preservation. Scholars, archivists, and museum professionals from across the country gathered to discuss Catherine's research and its implications for American historical institutions. Dr. Samuel Cross, the Blackwater County historian who had initially provided background on the Beauregard plantation, delivered the symposium's keynote address. Catherine Whitmore asked questions that needed asking, he stated. She applied scientific methodology to historical claims that had been accepted without sufficient scrutiny. Her disappearance should concern anyone who believes in academic freedom and historical accuracy. The symposium concluded with a disturbing acknowledgement. Catherine's case might represent a broader pattern of intimidation facing historians whose research challenged powerful interests. Several attendees shared stories of research projects that had been quietly discouraged, funding that had been withdrawn, and academic positions that had been threatened when scholars pursued controversial historical questions. Today, Catherine Whitmore's authentication equipment remains missing. Her research into Foundation-funded museums continues through anonymous networks, and her disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. The Blackwater Historic House Museum operates normally, presenting its carefully curated version of Civil War history to thousands of annual visitors. But questions persist. How many other historians have encountered similar obstacles when their research threatened powerful institutional interests? How much of America's preserved historical narrative reflects authentic scholarship versus politically motivated construction? And what happened to Dr. Catherine Whitmore when she came too close to exposing systematic historical manipulation? The answers remain hidden somewhere in the Spanish moss-draped forests of Blackwater County, waiting for someone brave enough to continue Catherine's unfinished authentication.
If this case stays with you, you're not alone. Here at Unresolved America, we cover cases like this every single day. Stories that deserve to be remembered, questions that refuse to fade. If you want to keep these investigations alive, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Drop a like if this story moved you, and leave a comment telling us which detail haunts you most. Until tomorrow, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions.